about the prospects of the scheduled Springbok tour to Australia. And so 22 of these cricketers made a highly unusual public political protest against government sports policy. The trigger was that Jack Cheetham had approached government proposing that the team to Australia should include 2 black players, only to be told sternly that the touring side must be slechts 'n blanke span. Cheetham went public with this rebuff, and a week later, Newlands hosted a game between the champion province, Transvaal I'm afraid, and versus the rest. The game was high profile, not only because it brought 22 of the top players against each other, but it was an official part of the Van Riebeck Festival, and it was also informally but quite clearly a final trial for selection to the Australian tour. Proctor opened the bowling to Barry Richards, and after a single ball, all the players walked off and handed the media a statement as brief as their protest, and immediately resumed the game. The statement read, quote, "We fully support SACA's application to include non-whites on the tour to Australia if good enough, and furthermore, fully subscribe to merit being the only criterion on the cricket field," unquote. That was the statement in its entirety. 4 cabinet ministers at the ground stormed out, and in a show of petulance, the deeply unlikable Minister of Sport, Frank Waring, cancelled a braai for the players that night. The NP press called the players unpatriotic, long-haired hippies, childish and laughable demonstrators. Now, on any scale of political radicalism, their walk-off registers somewhere between timid and tentative. But one must remember how conformist and deferential the white cricket establishment had been for so long in order to understand the impact that that protest had. There was, your Tiffy Barnes quote, was that from an interview with him? Tiffy Barnes. It's from your book, Cricket in Isolation. There was some justifiable skepticism about the sudden conversion to the support of non-racial cricket. Tiffy Barnes, mentioned by André last night, a player classified as coloured, commented, and I'm quoting, "They were so happy and contented that they never gave black South Africans a second thought. But when it all started crumbling around them, they started showing concern not for us, but for themselves," unquote. And the former Springbok, Owen Wynne, agreed, I'm quoting from him, "Only now that they, white sportsmen, are being ousted from world sport, do they, in the hope of being accepted, turn to the non-whites and say, 'All right, we'll give you a chance,'" unquote. And indeed, some of those who walked off later agreed. Barry Richards acknowledged that the protest was driven, quote, "by the real possibility of being cast out from the test scene." And Mike Proctor conceded that the whole idea, and I'm quoting, was to pacify international opinion, and he added that in retrospect it seemed like tokenism, a patronizing gesture that amounted to window dressing. And rather like the players, cricket administrators realized by 1971 that change was not an option, but a necessity. During the 70s, white administrators pursued a 3-pronged strategy. They tried to distance themselves more than SACA previously had been from government. They tried to provide some assistance, financial and coaching assistance, to black cricket, and they took the first steps to some kind of integration and unification of the sport. SACA set up a trust fund to provide financial support to black cricket, especially junior cricket. This was rejected by SACBOK, remember the non-racial body formed in '58, as a bribe, saying that it was difficult to reconcile the almost indecent haste of the approach after 80 years of indifference. But the SAACB, the African Cricket Board, representing African cricket, welcomed the offer and worked more closely with Saka. And then after 3 years of careful negotiation, in September 77, Saka, SACBOC, and the SAACB, the African body, merged to form the South African Cricket Union, SACU. SACU became the sole official body for South African cricket, and in a symbolic move elected Rashid Barachia, also in one of André's pictures last night, as its first president. But very soon, Hassan Hawa and the Western Province Cricket Board broke away and set up a rival body, the SACB, which was attached to SACOS, Hawa's non-racial sports council. And indeed, by the end of 1978, most of the previous SACBOC players had migrated back to Hassan Hawa and the SACB. But behind all these initiatives, firstly for Saka and then from SACU, the driving motivation was the desire to see South Africa readmitted to international cricket. And Dennis Dyer, on behalf of SACU, the new body, made a formal submission to the ICC, arguing in very loyally terms that the existing preconditions for readmission had been met. And in loyally terms, he was probably right. But SACU now discovered that the barriers to readmission had suddenly been raised. And the reasons for this are simple. SACU could hardly have come into existence at a less propitious moment. The mid-70s had seen South Africa lurch into a political and economic crisis. Economic growth gave way to recession. The geopolitics of the region were transformed. Left-wing governments in Mozambique and Angola, and Smith's UDI regime on its last legs. And then, of course, in June 1976, the Soweto uprising set in process years of endemic urban protest and resistance. Soweto was also critical in the way that it ratcheted up international anti-apartheid opinion. And in terms of the sports boycott, Hassan Hawa's famous slogan, "No normal sport in an abnormal society," increasingly shaped international opinion. It was no longer enough for this sport or that to reform its structures. The dismantling of apartheid became the precondition for South Africa's return to the international fold. In 1978, in response to Dyer's submission, the ICC accepted that there was now a single body representing cricketers of all races committed to, quote, normal cricket. And although the Australian and English boards were extremely sympathetic to SACU's case, they simply were not prepared to recommend readmission for fear of splitting international cricket entirely on racial lines. The West Indies, India, Pakistan and Sri Lanka insisted that the 1977 Gleneagles Agreement be observed. Gleneagles, signed by every single Commonwealth country, required their governments to dissuade their national sports bodies from any contact with South Africa. Now, SACU was formed 3 months after the Gleneagles Agreement, and in the same month as news of Steve Biko's death murdered by the police. The cricket establishment's efforts to restructure the game across racial divides was a classic case of too little, too late. Too little, too late, but well ahead of the tortuous efforts by the National Party government to adopt its sports policies into something vaguely acceptable internationally. 1971, Foster's government unveiled a multinational sports policy. There were so many nations living in South Africa, etc. And then, more significantly, in 1979, P.W. Botha's government announced a policy of autonomy in sport. Each sports body, the governing body of each sport, could take autonomous decisions. They had delegated the responsibility, could take autonomous decisions about interracial sport. The Group Areas Act would no longer apply to sporting events, and in theory, national teams were open to all races. Now, I'm not going to spend any time detailing the contortions and contradictions of these clumsy efforts. Just sum them up, that far from normalizing sport, they demonstrated the abnormality of apartheid. And after its rebuff by the ICC, SACU now changed tack and pursued an entirely different strategy to counter isolation. For the 1980s was the era of rebel tours. SACU had learned from Kerry Packer, 1978-9, the World Series venture. SACU had learned from Packer that the cricket establishment could be made to bow to the power of the market. That if they were paid enough, international cricketers were prepared to breach the Gleneagles Agreement and to ignore the moral and political case for boycotting South Africa. And so, deprived of a diet of international cricket, SACU and white fans settled instead for the thin gruel of rebel tours. The first took place in 1982, when the Springbok team lined up against the South African Breweries English 11, led by Graham Gooch. It was an odd collection of cricketers, wrote Matthew Engel. The aging, the out of favour, the fringe internationals, the pissed off. They were dubbed by the British media the Dirty Dozen, and they were handsomely paid. Gooch, wrote Simon Barnes, one of the most senior English cricketing journalists, Gooch was bribed to take part in test matches which weren't test matches. He was paid to pretend that South Africa was a normal place in which normal sport could take place. He was paid to show the world that apartheid was a damn good thing, unquote. Upon their return, Gooch and his team players were banned from Test cricket for 3 years. The same penalty that was imposed on the members of the two Australian rebel teams, both led by Kim Hughes. However, the West Indian and Sri Lankan players who toured were on a route to short-term prosperity and long-term pariahhood. They were dealt with far more stringently. They received life bans, later rescinded, and they experienced acute social ostracism. Ironically, the final group of touring mercenaries contributed to hastening real change in South Africa. Just as D'Oliveira had served as the catalyst for expulsion, so Gatting provided the catalyst for unification and return. Now, throughout the 1980s, Ali Bacher and other SACU officials justified the rebel tours as providing resources for their development program. We only let these tours take place so we can channel the money into black cricket. In 1989, Bacher, at the Wisden dinner, the annual Wisden dinner, boasted of, quote, the revolution taking place in South African cricket. And he portrayed SACU as in the van, I'm quoting, of progressive forces who want to destroy apartheid. 3 months later, the news broke that Bacher had initiated and organized in secret a rebel tour to be captained by Mike Gatting. Gatting was joined by 15 other English players, including 9 of the 29 who played in that year's disastrous Ashes series. 29 players picked for England. They were memorably described by a journalist as a motley collection of the greedy, the stupid, the disillusioned, and the unthinking. The tour was a fiasco. The security costs to SACU ran to 14 million rand, about 5 times the annual spend on development. When the squad landed at Johannesburg, police dogs and tear gas were used to disperse demonstrators, and that evening, black workers in the tour hotel refused to serve the tourists. Marches and protests greeted the team wherever they went. British cricket fans, incidentally, overwhelmingly agreed with Imran Khan, who said the central issue raised by the rebel tour is a moral one. On February the 2nd, 3 weeks into the tour, F.W. de Klerk announced the unbanning of the liberation movements and the imminent release of Mandela. And Gatting's team now became a kind of lightning rod for political expectations and political impatience. The team was now a symbol of an old regime on its last legs. Mandela, of course, walked out of Victor Verster into the glare of the global media on the 11th of February. And 3 days later, on Valentine's Day, the plug was pulled on the ill-advised adventure. Bacher, apparently without consulting either Gatting or the tour manager David Graveney, brought it to a premature close, and the team went back to a derisive reception in the UK. At this point, cricket in South Africa, this is now February, March, April 1990, cricket became a testing ground for negotiations and reconstruction. The key development within sports politics mirrored exactly the key development within politics nationally, a shift towards negotiation as the mechanism for change. SACOS, which for years had been the most militant anti-apartheid voice in sport, suddenly found itself marginalized, even irrelevant. It would not consider negotiations. It had refused to cooperate with the UDF, and its non-collaboration had become a principle rather than a strategy. And instead, in 1989, there had emerged a new body, the National Sports Congress, NSC, which was close to the UDF and to the ANC. It led the protests against Gatting, and within a few months, the NSC was the most important single actor in the unfolding story of South African cricket. Bacher executed a 180-degree U-turn and now worked closely with Steve Tshwete and Mululeki George in the ANC and the National Sports Congress, and he took part enthusiastically in unity talks. And in June 1991, the UCB, the United Cricket Board, was launched, a merger of SACU and the SACB. It committed itself to the urgent redress of imbalances between black cricket and white cricket, and promised to funnel resources into disadvantaged areas. It used very much the language, very prevalent then, of the Reconstruction and Development Program, very much an ideal which sustained those involved in negotiations, whether nationally or in the cricket sphere. The fruits of unity were immediate. Return to the ICC in July, a hastily arranged tour to India, where 3 ODIs are played. André, I think you were at those. I envy you. And then a short tour of the West Indies, where South Africa in the only test were ambrosed and washed. And then participation in 1992 in the World Cup. Jonty's diving run out and 22 runs required of 1 ball, probably the best remembered moments. Now, I'm not going to walk you through the history of Proteas cricket since 1992. It's a story you're familiar with, highs and lows, on and off the field. Instead, I'm going to take a single theme, arguably the dominant issue in cricket for the last 25 years, transformation. But I'm going to locate an analysis of cricket's transformation within a broader account of the term and the process of transformation. Because once upon a time, in 1994 to be precise, South Africa was on the brink of transformation. The ANC said so repeatedly. Mandela said so, quote, "Our country is going through a profound transformation which will permeate every level of government, every department, and every public institution." The RDP promised, quote, "a vision for the fundamental transformation of South Africa." And in 1994, the ANC's electoral slogan was the ultimate promise of transformation, a better life for all. Now, the language, the rhetoric of transformation promised too much and too little. It promised too much because many of those uttering the call knew perfectly well that the negotiated settlement imposed formidable limits on what the ANC could actually change, let alone change fundamentally. They knew that the negotiated outcome did not herald fundamental shifts in the distribution of economic or social power, that the state had not been dismantled but taken over more or less intact under new management. Transformation also promised too little because it did not specify exactly what would be changed, by whom, how, or when. Wielding transformation as a slogan actually drained it of political meaning as a program. And once the dust of the 1994 election had settled, a semantic shift took place. The term transformation remained central, ubiquitous in post-apartheid language, but it acquired new meanings. It became unthreatening. It was shorn of its association with struggle and resistance. The term could be adopted by political parties schooled in Afrikaner nationalism and conservative liberal frameworks, and by big business. Transformation no longer implied the possibility of fundamental change. UCT's constitutional lawyer, Pierre de Vos, has tracked the shifting meanings of transformation. And he's criticized the tendency to reduce transformation to a synonym for affirmative action. Quote, "a demand for the transfer of power from one racial elite to another." He warned a couple of years ago that the term was being bandied about, and I'm quoting, as if transformation is about replacing reactionary, middle-aged white patriarchs with reactionary, middle-aged black patriarchs, unquote. There was an absolutely decisive ideological lurch away from any hint of structural change. Transformation, divested of radicalism, was reduced increasingly to head counts, a numbers game in which representativity is the key term. Now, that critique, and that is a critique of transformation, or at least of its limits, has been applied with some ferocity to South African cricket by Ashwin Desai, the sociologist, cricket historian, in his book, Reverse Sweep. The book covers the politics of cricket's transition. It explains, I found very helpfully, the extraordinary speed at which unification and readmission took place. And it has an entertaining chapter on Ali Bacher's chameleon career, although Dr. Bacher might not find it entertaining. It has an intriguing chapter on the Hansi Cronje saga and who knew what when. Desai also shows that by 1998, questions about the development program in cricket, what was it delivering, and the continuing selection of all white teams had produced an untenable situation. He's very good on how the triumvirate of Woolmer, Cronje, and Peter Pollock, coach, captain, and chair of selectors, were unsympathetic to transformation, how they continued to insist on the mantra that teams should be picked entirely for cricket reasons. The UCB, for its part, accepted the need for a rethink. It held a series of vision seminars, it wrote a transformation charter, mentioned last night, and created a transformation monitoring committee, which would oversee and assess transformation, and which was chaired by André for 3 years. Yeah, 3 or 4 years. Desai's assessment and his critique of transformation is at the heart of his book. I cannot do it justice here, but I'm going to reduce his critique of transformation in cricket to 5 points. Firstly, paralleling the way that the ANC during negotiations made major concessions on the economy so that an anticipated democratic dividend never materialized. Redistribution did not happen. And Desai suggests that the hasty process of unification was based on the promise of a massive development program funded by the largesse of the international game, and that this also failed to bear fruit. If the negotiations at Codesa involved compromises and concessions on both sides, so did the negotiations which led to the formation of the UBC. Sam Ramsamy rather bluntly put it, I'm quoting, "We decided on compromise. The blacks would let whites have international competition, and the whites would provide facilities and opportunities for black development in sport." And this trade-off suggests Desai did not deliver. Secondly, once in power, again, Desai argues, the ANC as a government opted for reformative rather than transformative politics. It did not seek to change fundamentally the way society worked, but prioritized reconciliation and cooperative government. It based its economic policies on restoring business confidence and attracting international foreign investment, assuming that economic benefits would naturally trickle down to the poor. In cricket, he argues, a similar reformative logic was followed. The benefits from international tours and the commercialization of sport would be used to uplift sport in disadvantaged areas. A transformative approach, by contrast, would have prioritized a bottom-up, mass-based approach. Thirdly, Desai is critical of the shift within the language of transformation away from non-racialism to Africanism, to a racial assertiveness that seemed to challenge not only white privilege, but also potential Indian and colored advances. And he argues that for the first time, the rubric of black development, which had included African, colored, and Indian cricketers, was now narrowed to a focus on African players. He also argues that Africans were catapulted into the upper echelons of administration, a bit like BEE in the private sector. The same way that corporate boardrooms were deracialized, in cricket, quote, they would begin at the top by populating the long rooms. Fourthly, Desai, who was a member of the TMC, felt that it had become, quote, bogged down in its desire for detail about how many black umpires or female scorers were coming through. And he felt that this put on the back burner really important issues like the corporatization of the game and the lack of state support for township schools, sport in township schools. In 2003, Mongezi Gerald Majola was appointed CEO of the UCB, part of the Africanization, bringing an end to the Bacher era. By that point, a majority of provincial presidents and members of the UC board were black. But Desai argues that these changes in the demographic makeup did not achieve much, especially, he says, as the new black leadership largely assumed the privileges previously accorded to white administrators and showed little commitment to broadening the game against traditional preserves. And fifthly, and this is the last part, the last point, he makes the point that the two camps, the two schools that prevail in debates about transformation in sport. One maintains that only merit and not race should be involved in the selection of provincial and national teams, and the second emphasizes the meeting of targets and quotas so that more demographically representative teams take the field. And he points out that both of these positions fail to address the workings of class and privilege in cricket achievement. Most of the top African players have come through Model C and private schools. Cricket in township schools is negligible. And instead of broad-based development, the emphasis has increasingly been on siphoning off the most promising black players into selected schools and high-performance centers. It has become, he says, about producing showpiece players for the national squad at the expense of grassroots cricket. I'm now going to hand over the mic and responsibilities to André. Ask him to comment, if he chooses, on Desai's critique, but also, André, I think more generally about the last 20 years. Thank you. Put it just do that for me. Thanks. It's going to write here.
I never taught using a blackboard like Colin. He's much neater than I am on this. Thanks very much, Colin. Good evening again, everyone. It's really been a pleasure to spend time with you this week and also to get to know some people. Colchester cricketers from 1952, and Mr. Metz here has just brought his cricket album that started in 1949 in Holland, and he played cricket in Bandung in Indonesia in 1954 and all sorts of interesting places. Thanks very much for sharing that and also giving me some material. And there's people who were at Rodin, and it's been very pleasant, Colin, and I feel just having interacted with you. And if anyone wants to follow up, conversation, cup of coffee or anything, you're very welcome to email me, okay? Colin said he's going to hand over to see if I've got anything to say. What he's actually done is lobbed a hand grenade towards me with 6 very, very difficult questions, very critical of transformation. So it's a bit like I was an opening batsman to go and open on a green mamba with a South African pace attack. So there's not much you can do except defend, and I don't want to do that. So I would like to talk about Ashwin Desai also is a friend, as well as he's a social movement activist, anti-globalization, a wonderful person, and I'm the only chairperson who's ever managed to keep him in a committee for 3 years. Because he sort of doesn't work in institutions. It was a very good experience that we had together. So I don't want to be defensive, but I just want to caution a bit about an analysis that's just a little bit too easy. And before I get going on that, just two parts of what you mentioned. The one was Ali Bacha started seeing Packer, buying your way out. It was actually much deeper than that. Ali was appointed as the first CEO of Gauteng Cricket in a commercial sense, as a professional CEO, rather than an official who ran the office. And he was supported by Don Mackay-Coghill, who worked for one of the mining companies, and a whole lot of business professionals in Johannesburg. So the beginning of professionalization and the creation of the mean machine was actually very much part of the beginning of the more serious reform agendas by the state and capital following the Soweto uprisings and the death of Biko and so on. Even P.W. Botha or Foster said we've got to adapt or die, and business was very aware of this. And you had, for instance, the emergence of the Urban Foundation with Jan Steyn, who's also been a club president in Cape Town, and out of that came the kind of tricameral path which tried to co-opt a black middle class. And this cash-in cricket, and the commercial approach was very much tied up to that period of South African society. And it wasn't just buying them, following a commercial model. There was actually active cooperation between the SACU, the South African Cricket Union, and the government in the 80s. The rebel tours were part of an active cooperation to break the stranglehold of growing sanctions. So Joe Pimensky, for instance, got the 90% tax deduction for tours after approaching Gerrit Viljoen and other people and getting that law or measure passed in Parliament, that 90% of your sponsorship gets given back to you if you support an international tour. Came from cricket. And it was a very successful way for Yellow Pages to say we spent 10 million rand, but they got 9 million back from the government. It was a very active part of the 1980s total onslaught stuff. So when you talk about everyone agreeing there must be change and reform, we must not forget how limited it was, how lacking in vision it was, actually. That's the first point I just thought. And then secondly, my only defensive part, when you talk about transformation, both in terms of it being the 1994 kind of byword, as well as generally, I think you've got to be much more specific about specific areas of transformation, because it meant different things in different places, where the balance of forces were different and people could push and meant it in certain places. Sam Ramsami's version of what unity meant was absolutely not what it meant to us on the ground, for instance. So that's just, but I agree with probably most of the points that Ashwin makes. Some points we must remember, Colin, is that we need to appreciate more the weakness of SACOS by the late 80s, and also the difficulties and the change management skills that were needed to actually create unity in sport. It was, again, not something worked out on paper as much as using a historical moment to push the system in a certain direction. And at a time when both SACOS was weak and also cricket itself, the non-racial board. So SACOS by that stage had held onto the principle of non-collaboration for too long. It was very successful in the 70s when the boycott was starting, and to get a political voice post-Soweto that was very forceful and could hold people behind a banner of struggle that says you can't play normal sport in an abnormal society. It became a very effective way to stop the free flow of people who were wanting opportunities within the Baja system. Because within your community you'd become isolated, and it also politically was a very strong one. But by the mid-1980s, South Africa was going into an insurrectionary mode. From August 1985, those Vaal uprisings that went to the Eastern Cape, and that for the next 5 or 8 years it was a very repressive environment, a lot of open challenge of the state, both in the struggle side and the counter-revolutionary onslaught after the states of emergency was a very, very heavy period. And in that period, the level of mass mobilization increased very much. And at Kabwe in 1985, post that, the ANC started looking at a negotiated solution to end the war at some stage. That is what I'm writing about now in my book with Albie Sachs on the first steps in the making of the Constitution. And it's an incredibly interesting period. It wasn't seizure of power and insurrection until 89 and then switching. Tambo said, when the time comes, all conflict ends in talks. We must be ready, and what is it that we're going to put in place? And they were very clear that it must be two things about the forces for change, the reform agenda of the ruling classes was, firstly, it must stop the ANC from getting into power. So you look from the PFP to Anglo-American, the Brenthurst think tank in Darbas, through to P.W. Botha. We can't have the ANC here. They were demonized. Secondly, it must be based on some form of group rights to dilute majoritarianism and therefore not let change happen. And that is why you had consociationism, federalism in KwaZulu-Natal in Daba. All of those things, supported by Helmut Kohl, Margaret Thatcher, and Ronald Reagan, were attempts to stop the full impact of a transformative democracy, of self-determination. And the ANC already in January 1986 had worked out the basic template for what was signed in 1996. Colin will be interested to read this when our book is ready. And that was a very simple thing. Paulo Jordan said you have to win the middle ground, or else the state, the regime, and capital will take the black middle class with them, and you'll end up in disarray. Because we're in exile, it's a fragile situation, there's incredible repression in the country, and he said there's an unhealthy preoccupation or unhealthy tendency in the ANC to reify one-party states. The Soviet model, Mozambique, Angola, one-party states after 10 years were not working anymore. And Tambo and Paulo Jordan, which Colin edited Jordan's writings, said that the way forward is to guarantee a Bill of Rights and multi-party democracy based on the protection of every individual and the recognition of every individual as a South African. So the no-no is group rights in any form. And they were totally consistent with that. And going with that was then to put pressure on the regime in different ways. And mass mobilization became an essential part of the way the balance of power was changed. So after Kabwe, you saw sectoral mobilization happening in different areas. In December 1985, the Soweto Parents Committee went to Lusaka and they said to the ANC, "We're worried that the children aren't in school." The ANC spoke to the UDF and COSATU, and by March 1986, there was a National Education Crisis Committee in place, which said we mustn't just break down, we must start building the future. And that sectoral mobilization happened in a whole lot of areas. For instance, NADEL, National Association of Democratic Lawyers, Pius Langa, Dalla Omar, speaking in Lusaka, coming home and setting those up. SACO, the South African Youth Congress. If you want to read a good book, Mkhuseli Jack's book that's just come out is wonderful about the Eastern Cape in the 80s. He was told, you guys need to pull together the youth in South Africa because they're very wild and you need to bring them into an organized formation. SACO gets formed in March 87. So the same thing's happening in sport. Arnold Stofile went to New Zealand in 1986 and torpedoed the All Black Tour. But Sakos said, that's all sort of game playing that you people are involved in. Sakos belonged to the National Forum, which was formed at the same time as the UDF in August 1983. They believed in a theoretical construct of permanent revolution and the political economy will ultimately bring capitalism to an end and then you can have normal sport. So it was a very rarefied theoretical construct, very valuable and with a lot of validity, just like the kind of class analysis that one has heard from Ashwin, but totally impractical because SACOS consisted mainly of coloured constituencies. So the leadership of SACOS was unity movement. Its political base was parties that got less than 1% or maybe 1% in 1994. And it was getting out of truck with the sectoral mobilization that was happening. So it didn't only happen in 89 that SACOS was dropped. From 86, the ANC was saying we need to use sport more forcefully inside the country. And the decisive moment was not agreeing to negotiations, but actually stopping the Gauteng tour. And the Kimberley demonstrations that shocked Bacha. Bacha went home and his children said to him, "Dad, you cannot still always be on the wrong side of these things. It is wrong what is happening here." And that was the Kimberley demonstrations that stopped that tour in its tracks. And that is a June 16th moment in sport in South Africa. So you can't also have an analysis that's devoid of struggle and that goes back to 58 with SASA, Sandrock being formed. SACOS was formed in 1973. So the radicalism of the late 70s is already being built in 1973. Okay, so I mustn't overdo the point, but the weakness of SACOS was fatal in its very sort of pure politics and not in numbers there. So for instance, soccer, which as you can see today is the sport of South Africa in a massive way, they were regarded as collaborators by SACOS. How can all the people in Soweto who love football be part of the enemy camp? I'm simplifying it a little bit, but so that was the weakness. Cricket also was in a very weak. I played non-racial cricket for a few years. It was an incredible experience, and I was elected as a player onto the last Western Province Cricket Board team, which executive which negotiated unity with the Western Province Cricket Union, and the South African Cricket Board was in big trouble. Firstly, group areas had destroyed the base of cricket in the black communities. 1970s, and District 6 was finally cleared by about 83. My wife was one of the last people's houses broken down. Absolutely destroyed sport and social cohesion. So the team I played for was United Cricket Club. As the players, as the families, 80,000 families were forcefully removed from their homes and put in Hanover Park and all these drug places now. And as they left, the cricket clubs collapsed. The only things that stayed were the churches and the mosques that people came back to. So the Claremont Mosque you see there today. And as these teams collapsed, they had to form together. So United is called United because it's the amalgamation of 11 previous clubs that existed in the city, in Claremont, in the southern suburbs, and the Boerkaap. And all that was destroyed. 10 years later, the impact of that was being felt, and it was made much stronger also by the chaos in schools. So as the 80s struggles went going, the schools became places of demonstration and boycott and stuff, not to play sport, even though they didn't always have facilities. But that whole thing of the school as a basis for building also collapsed. So by 1989, SACB was in trouble. Their standard was the lowest it had been from those great years in the 50s and the 60s when people, 7 or 8 or 9 people from Cape Town went to play league cricket in England following D'Oliveira. So you had a high level of politicization and militancy, and the ground was being changed in practical terms. The state was also denying people facilities and also dismissing teachers and sending them to the Northern Cape and things like that if they were activists. So it's not as though it was a choice that people could decide, to keep the top. It was a constant struggle to try and gain the ground over a white cricketing establishment that was totally in control of facilities, had the support of business and sponsors, television, and were relatively strong on the ground. That's something we mustn't forget either. Okay. So the important point I want to make, secondly, is just, so the first one is understand the conditions on the ground before you glibly say cricketers united and bought into a kind of easy narrative. Secondly, it was, I think this is a very important point, I'm reinforcing it again, it was actually the demonstrations against Gatting that stopped the rebel tours and helped change the power in sport. Up until that time, like whites in general, they thought they could manage change. But Bacha was shown there that he cannot go forward without without support from the disenfranchised. I'm reading on the late 80s now, and also the negotiations that happened in England with Mbeki and in prison with Mandela. And the sport issue came up in the Mel's Park negotiations. But I read an interview in the O'Malley archive this week with Herman Gillemier,